and welcome to this third edition of the Energy Solutions for the Future broadcast. My name is Caleb Adebayo. The ESF broadcast is a monthly series curated as short interviews of policy experts in the energy space, interrogating various energy challenges in Nigeria and possible solutions to them, with an aim to working towards an energy-rich future, one that is sustainable, efficient, and affordable. Today, we have with us a distinguished energy executive, Rolake Akinkugbe-Filani, who I will be discussing with on the topic, where is the money? Roadmap to financing the energy transition. Rolake is a chief commercial officer at Mixta Africa, where she recently made a career transition to add real estate and affordable housing infrastructure to her portfolio. Prior to this, she was the senior advisor to the IFU, the Danish Investment Fund, and recently sat on the global advisory board of Canadian private equity firm StoneChair Capital, advising on its $300 million Energy Africa Fund. From 2014 to 2019, she was head of energy for FB and Quest Merchant Bank. And with a deep passion to make a difference in the energy sector, she founded Inatide, a not-for-profit social enterprise aimed at helping renewable energy off-grid and mini-grid entrepreneurs access finance. She has also been a member of the Private Sector Economic Advisory Group in the Office of the Vice President of Nigeria, working closely with the Chief Economic Advisor and the VP's office on a range of national development policy issues. Welcome, Ms. Akinkugbe-Filani. Good to have you here.
Thank you so much, Caleb. Thanks for having me, and I'm really, really thrilled to be on this series.
Thank you very much. Did I get the pronunciation of that right? Is it Inatide or Inatide?
Inatide. It's actually a Yoruba word.
Oh, yes. Inatide.
It's usually written with an accent on the E. So
yes. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for joining me today. So I'll dive right into the first question I have here. And it's a question that has been bothering not just me, but a number of people I've had conversations with over time concerning the energy transition. So the global effort to completely transition to clean energy by the year 2050 has been estimated to cost around $73 trillion. Is financing the transition possible, or is it just an abstract concept?
Wow, that's a big question. I think we could write a thesis on that if we wanted, an entire PhD thesis. Well, I guess the first place I would start is really to just understand what the energy transition is. I think we often take for granted that when we talk about energy transition, people know what we're talking about. The energy transition is essentially the global movement towards transitioning from fossil fuel-based economies to zero carbon economies. And essentially what that seeks to do is around fossil fuel generated CO2 emissions. The global move to reduce that to zero by a certain time period. That is why it's called a transition. Now, as we know with most types of transitions, there are several things that need to happen to make that transition possible: policy, finance, investment, technology. But I'm sure we can both agree that finance is the biggest driver of many of those things. So the question is, where is the money going to come from? Show me the money. The first part I guess I can start from is looking at, you mentioned $73 trillion. I would actually suspect that maybe that's slightly understated, given the fact that for each day or each year that passes, we discover new challenges posed by the global energy sector, particularly the emissions emitting energy sector. And what that means is that the calculations of how much capital will be required for the transition, as we get closer and closer to that transition, the amount of capital required is going to increase. So let's look at it from two perspectives. What do we want to transition from? We want to transition from, broadly speaking, economies that are heavily reliant on oil, gas, coal, or any other sort of hydrocarbons to cleaner forms of energy, such as renewable energy, or some of the new technologies that we're talking about today, such as hydrogen. That's going to require investment, and investment in infrastructure, investments in production of the energy, investment in distribution of the energy, and also investment in consumption of the energy. I think what needs to happen is that the segmentation of those different needs needs to align with the source of finance. So today we have a global financial ecosystem that is made up of, commercial lenders, banks, investments, institutional investors, private equity funds, development finance institutions, and of course, private investors or corporate investors. If we bring it home to Nigeria here, we know that from an infrastructure perspective, we're already underspending. So the money is going to have to come from a wide variety of stakeholders. And in order to attract that money, there needs to be projects, transition projects that are bankable, right? That are able to attract capital. And we can talk a bit more about these specific dynamics as we go along.
Great, but you do think that it is possible to achieve the energy transition? Well,
I certainly think that it is possible to achieve the energy transition, but we keep saying achieve a transition. The transition is an ongoing process. So let me break it down to the Nigerian example. If we say Nigeria has to transit from an oil-based economy to a clean economy, we're all talking about the clean recovery, the green recovery post-COVID. One of the things that we need to do is look at transition fuels like gas. We need to look at gas. So I certainly think Nigeria needs to harness its gas. What we also need to be thinking about is what is the optimal energy mix and balance for Nigeria, right? So the possibility of transition has to be within the context of what is required and expedient for each particular country or industry to do. Right now, Nigeria has a resource base of, almost 40 billion barrels of crude oil reserves and over 200 TCF, trillion cubic feet of gas reserves. So the question is, what do we do with those untapped resources within the transition? There's already, in light of the post-COVID environment, there's a strain on global credit sources. And many of these traditional projects, energy projects in themselves, are struggling to attract capital because of risk issues, whether that's political risk, environmental risk, or other type technology risks, or just the risks of performance of some of these assets. I think the transition is very much possible. And we're seeing some countries take the leadership role in Africa in this regard. Countries like South Africa and Morocco are already developing multi-billion-dollar renewable energy projects. So it is possible, but what it requires is not just the funding, but a regulatory and policy framework that supports that transition.
Great. So this leads me to my second question, and it's focused now on Nigeria. Do you think, and you might have mentioned a bit of it while you were speaking, but do you think that financing is the biggest challenge to the energy transition in Nigeria?
I may play a bit of devil's advocate on this one. I would say no, actually not financing. And I'll tell you why. I think you often hear about the doing business discourse. How easy is it to do business in Nigeria? I think it's a case of too much capital chasing too few opportunities. So whilst it seems like there's no money to facilitate energy sector investments, part of the challenge is that the capital that is available does not have enough bankable opportunities. And so I'm going to look at it for two angles. Let's just look at the gas infrastructure, because if we can both agree, you and I, that gas is a transition source of energy. It sits on the nexus between oil and renewables. And why do I say it's transition? Gas has, it's derived from dry gas, which is methane, which isn't as emissions emitting as traditional oil. So I would argue that gas is really at the heart of the energy transition for Nigeria, right? For Nigeria, not globally. So if we look at what is required to invest in gas infrastructure in Nigeria, these projects are hugely capital intensive. They require the conclusion of long-term contractual agreements. And so the kind of money you need is the kind of money that is prepared to stay with a project for 15, 20 years. And so if I'm going to come and put my money as an investor or a lender in a project for 15, 20 years, first of all, I have to know that there is a market for what the developer is producing or transporting or distributing, number one. I also have to know that the fiscal and tax incentives around this project are actually conducive, that they're enabling and that they're not penal. And then thirdly, I have to know that the environmental impact assessment is up to date, that I understand the environmental implications of this project. Guess what? Even energy transition projects can have environmental implications. Even renewable energy projects have environmental implications. And I'll give you a classic example. With solar PV projects that require battery storage, a key question is, what do we do after the service life of a particular solar PV module and the batteries? How do we dispose of the batteries, right? So even within the energy transition, we're having these debates around environmental impact. So when you start to look at all those issues, and then you think about, what if, I invest my money and for whatever reason, the developer does not perform? How do I protect myself or ensure myself against those risks? And so the question is not whether money is available, in my view, and I know it might be controversial for some, but also whether the projects that are in the pipeline are investment worthy. And I think what we need to do is to find ways to collaborate more with the public and private sector to ensure that we can develop a strong pipeline of projects. Because first of all, many of these projects are competing for capital in a constrained economic environment globally. A lot of the European development finance institutions, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, the European Investment Bank said it would no longer even invest in gas globally. So a lot of these DFIs, particularly from Europe, and many of these DFIs are the ones who can provide long-term sources of capital, are moving away from hydrocarbons to cleaner sources of fuel. So for those investors that still have appetite for gas, for instance, we need to do a lot more work to attract them.
Thank you very much for that. So you spoke on being funding ready, having the projects being bankable. Now that leads me to my next question. Is there money for energy transition for Nigerian private sector clean businesses? And if there is, and I know this is similar to the work you do at Inatide, if there is, how can they access it? What can they do? How can they be in the right place to access this financing for their businesses?
Yeah, very, very good question. So, and I think this is an important point, because we often talk about the big projects, but we have to look at the entrepreneurs who are developing off-grid and mini-grid. And one of the reasons I set up Inatide, and maybe I'll just take time to tell your audience a bit about that model, is when I was working maybe about 7 years ago in financial services, I discovered that we would get a lot of proposals on my desk. This was before my last job. We would get a lot of proposals from entrepreneurs saying, oh, they're developing a solar PV project, they're developing a waste to energy project, they're struggling to attract funding from banks, and because, people don't really understand the space, can you help? And even within the institution I worked at the time, they weren't very familiar with renewable energy. So most, finances were like, nah, this is not for us. So I realized that there was a gap in the market. And part of the challenge that many of these entrepreneurs and developers had is that they didn't have bankable business plans. And so I thought to myself, well, somebody needs to help bridge that gap between the entrepreneurs and investors. And it can't just be some general incubator type model. This has to be something that's specially focused on renewable energy. And so in Inatide, what we do is help entrepreneurs prepare to be investment ready. If you look at the ecosystem for investments in this space, and I'm particularly talking about small scale projects that are probably less than 1 megawatts or even much lower, it's usually grants. We're seeing a lot of grants in the market. So we have organizations like the USA Power Africa program. We also have the the DFID, Department for International Development in the UK. And even within Nigeria, you have organizations like the Rural Electrification Agency, REA, of Nigeria, who are providing grants to developers at early stage. But we're also seeing an expanding pool of venture capital that is really interested in new energy. And it's a trend that we've also seen with the advent of new sectors like fintech, financial technology. So I'll give you some practical examples there. I don't know if you're familiar with developers like Arnergy or RentSource. last year or earlier this year and last year, there were several fairly chunky for that space Series A deals, Series A rounds that were made. I mean, some of these guys were able to raise money with ticket sizes of $9 million, $10 million. So we're seeing some interest in early stage investors who want to bring growth capital into many of these businesses that are innovating in the Nigerian renewable energy space. So there is money available. And we've also seen that for some of the bigger developers, there are a few banks, for instance, like Sterling Bank, who are now developing renewable energy desks, right? So that they can focus on how to structure commercial lending. As we know, interest rates are a challenge. The other challenge, and if I may add, just to finally answer this question, is on the consumer finance side. At the height of this COVID-19 lockdown, with the Nigerian government's economic recovery plan, the government came out with a plan to deliver 5 million, I think it was 25, somewhere between 5 and 25 million solar home systems across Nigeria. And of course, it's going to need to work with private sector partners. But the question is, how are these households going to pay for renewable energy? So one of the things that we are trying to work on in terms of innovating is around consumer finance for renewable energy, particularly in the offtake side. How can you create structures? Because from an investor perspective, look, if the company I'm investing in doesn't have a market that is creditworthy and is liquid to provide offtake, then it becomes challenging. So Inatide is really at the forefront of trying to plug the loops. And even as a renewable energy advisor, we're a nonprofit social enterprise. And so in the renewable energy value chain, we're part of that value chain as advisors. And our business model depends on grants, right? That is what our business model depends on. So I think there's funding, but the knowledge, there's a dearth of skills. The Nigerian financial ecosystem has been used to funding and structuring oil and gas projects. So we also need an energy transition within the financial services space so that we can build that institutional knowledge to more adequately support renewable energy businesses.
I agree. Thank you very much for that. You mentioned commercial banks. With respect to financing the energy transition, can we trust commercial banks? And in addition to that question, how about alternative forms of financing like private equity and pension funds? I know you are very much interested in these areas. Are these viable and effective means of funding the energy transition?
Yeah, I mean, I think, basically, yes, we can trust commercial banks. I think it's not so much an issue of trusting commercial banks. Commercial banks, thankfully, are regulated by a regulator. So you're a depositor in a commercial bank, Caleb, yourself. I should ask you, can you trust a commercial bank to hold your money and make sure that your money is secure?
Sure. Can we trust them to fund the energy transition?
There we go. Yes, I just wanted to clear the air so that it doesn't seem like we're questioning the trustworthiness of banks in general. But so I think it's really a matter of capacity and knowledge and skill. What many of these projects need is patient capital, right? And patient capital has specific characteristics. It's by virtue, it's patient, it's long-term. It takes risk. It has an appetite for risk because many of these technologies have not been around for so long. But the basic and fundamental premise of any deal where you're going to provide credit is the same. Tell me that you have a track record, right? That you've done this before, you have a track record of performance, you have a good management team, and I have a view to cash flows. I would not advise any startup in the renewable energy space today to approach a commercial bank to find money on a commercial basis. Now, some of these banks may have special grants of funds that they have received money from DFIs on which they are then mandated to lend on at specific interest rates. But you should only be going to a commercial bank as a renewable energy business in Nigeria after you've already, first of all, put your own skin in the game. You've also looked at private equity for the initial stages, and then you've reached a level of skill that then requires debt funding. We don't have a lot of time on this conversation to go into the intricacies of the capital structure and all of that. But I wouldn't say commercial banks would be my first port of call if I was a renewable energy developer. We've seen much more interest from venture capital and private equity investors. And of course, The model in terms of what they look at in terms of bankability is similar, but many of these investors also have strategic goals, which means that they may bring some operational expertise to bear. Some of them would have financed or invested in similar projects in other parts of the world. But obviously they have to do their due diligence. So I think commercial banks will take some time to catch up. It must be said that the Bank of Industry, BOI, does have a solar energy fund with concessionary lending rates. So there are pools of capital within the financial services space in Nigeria itself. But that money has to be accessed via commercial banks. So it's really about being prepared, understanding the requirements to access financing, and ensuring that you have the right structure in place to tap into that financing.
Okay, great. What I hear is that there is money, and both parties just need to be ready. The funders on the one hand need to understand the market, and those who are looking for funds need to be ready for the funding. So my next question is on government side. If you have the opportunity to push for policy and regulatory changes that will enable financing for the energy transition in Nigeria, particularly in the area of access to finance, what 3 or 4 policy initiatives will you be proposing?
Yes, thank you. Very, very important. The first one I would say is that we need to look at the value chain for players in the sector. You know, what will it cost a solar energy company today to import a solar panel? We haven't developed yet the local manufacturing base fully. I know there are a lot of companies that are already looking into setting up local manufacturing for the components of solar equipment, such as panels. But the bulk of players in this space today have to import equipment from abroad. And if we're saying we want to support the energy transition and we want to electrify, you know, more than 5 million homes with solar home systems, you know, to achieve that policy that the government wants, we need to make it easy for entrepreneurs and operators in this space to do business. So first policy thing I would love to see is tax breaks for solar energy developers. You know, we've seen this model in other parts of the energy value chain. If you look at the marginal field operators on the oil and gas side, you know, there's a pioneer tax status, right, for companies in that space. And, you know, it really affects the economics of the project, you know, in terms of viability. So that's the number one thing. The number two policy change I would like to see is an actual energy transition policy. Nigeria needs an energy transition policy. So let me break this down a bit more. I think we have obviously a petroleum industry bill. We have a renewable energy policy. We have a mini grid regulation policy. NERC has also supported, alongside other stakeholders, the Ministry of Power, the Rural Information Agency of Nigeria. We all have individual policies, but many of these policies are pretty much silos, in the sense that, yes, there's a policy for this sector, but remember what I said, a transition means we're meant to get from here to here. We also have a national gas master plan and a framework for the gas sector. But what we need is a holistic, overarching energy transition plan. And I say that we can't afford to continue to turn a blind eye to this. We know that climate change is a big challenge. But we also know that Nigeria still has an abundance of hydrocarbons resources that it needs to continue to invest. So no one is saying that we're just going to, you know, turn off the oil and gas pump overnight and we'll all start, you know, living green. It's not going to happen, you know, overnight. But what we do need is policy that has foresight, that recognizes that energy transition needs to be a priority. And let's even break it down to why it should be a priority. Nigeria will continue to require hybrid solutions that combine gas, fossil fuels, renewable energy, but even look at the health implications. Just the ability for the average rural or semi-rural households to stop wood burning and use LPG. In a sense, that is an energy transition policy, right? So all of these things need to be seen as it's all for the common good, and there is space in that policy for every type of player. We just need something that requires leadership from the government. And then the third one is really setting up a strategic national fund to really help support investment into the renewable energy space. Those would be my 3 high-level recommendations.
All right, thank you very much. Very good recommendations. And I do hope that the government does take this on board. My next question is still on the involvement of big oil in the energy transition. A number of big oil companies are now in the race for net zero. Do you imagine that this shift will bring, in some way, attract finance towards clean energy?
I mean, in the sense that some of these international IOCs, because of their race towards net zero, could be interested in investing themselves, yes. But I mean, you would have seen quite a lot of publicity recently around, I think it was BP that had talked about moving towards this net zero strategy. And you know that for several years now, many of the international oil companies have started to rebrand themselves as energy companies, not oil companies. Yeah. And even you have companies like Total who have petrol stations in some countries that are powered by solar PV, the irony. But I think, again, that shows that a lot of them are realizing that, that the game has changed. And it's very important that you continue to innovate and you continue to move forward. And I would also mention that, because of the global climate change debate, if you look at what has happened from an investment perspective to oil and gas stocks on the stock markets globally, there's been a shift. A lot of technology companies have now emerged as the largest and most valuable companies in terms of valuations globally. So companies like ExxonMobil are being displaced by your Amazons, your Teslas, your, everything. I mean, Tesla, classic example, Tesla has one of the most innovative battery technologies globally. So what that is saying to me is that, there's disruption happening. And if you as an international energy company and IOC did not know that before, you can't say you don't know that. So the business models in these companies are changing. And hopefully that will mean that a lot of the cash flows that they do generate from traditional hydrocarbons, conventional can be started to be invested towards renewable energy investments or focusing much more on gas. And hopefully that will then support an ecosystem for the entire energy transition industry. And it's good to see many more of them at the forefront of debate on these issues. And the other thing that must be said really for countries like Nigeria, the PIB, I was on a webinar some days ago, and we talked about the PIB. And the reality is that I told people a piece of trivia that when the PIB was first conceived, it was around the time I was graduating from my first degree, which is, the bill was actually crafted in 2008, but the original conversation around the PIB was like 2001, 2002, right? And so it's been an almost 20-year journey of trying to craft oil and gas legislation. Meanwhile, in that 20-year journey, we've had several financial crises. We've had advancements in the global climate change talk. We've had a major shift in Europe towards renewable energy. So a lot has changed and we have lost a lot of ground. Yeah. So now we have a policy that perhaps one might even question its relevance in terms of the energy transition. Mm-hmm. Very relevant from a gas and oil sector regulatory perspective. But if we're talking energy transition, what does the PIB address? It doesn't actually address it. So the reality is, the game has changed, the landscape has changed, and it's important that even local oil and gas players in Nigeria have departments that are doing R&D, research and development around the energy transition and technologies that may ultimately disrupt their core business model.
Thank you very much. Well said indeed. So lastly, you have such an impressive profile, and there are young people who are listening to this that want to be thought leaders in the energy policy space and contribute to energy policy. What tips do you have for them? What should they do?
Thanks, Caleb. I feel like that should be an entire webinar in itself. But because I'm very passionate, I do a lot of mentorship. I have a mentorship group called Positive Energy, #Positive Energy. It's a play on words because I'm passionate about the space. But you know what? I always say that there are no shortcuts to this thing. You have to put in the work. You have to do the groundwork. You have to read widely around your industry. You can't just expect to transform into a thought leader overnight. And so you have to do the groundwork in terms of self-development and building yourself and professional development. And I'm not just talking about maybe professional qualifications, which are fantastic, but I'm also talking about things like networking, joining industry bodies, understand what is going on, connect with people in the sector, ask questions, don't be afraid to knock on doors. And in terms of some of the things that I found particularly useful is, just taking an interest in issues globally. One of the things that I often get asked comment on is a global angle. And I find that to be a constant trend, that even for Nigeria or local webinars or regional webinars, people always want me to talk about the global angle. So I always say to myself, when did this thing start? But I remember that many years ago, I started to read the FT, and I started to contribute to debates on the global stage because it's a global issue. Energy is not a Nigeria issue.
Totally.
It is a global issue. And one of the ways you can stand yourself out in this space, if you actually understand global markets and what's happening more broadly. And of course, find mentors. And it doesn't really have to be structured, but are there people whose career trajectory you admire? What it is that they've done to get where they are? If you can't even get close to them, right? Study their journey, listen to their videos. What are some of the things that they've done that have been particularly useful? That is really important. And then challenge yourself. What are you doing today that is different to what you've always done? You tell me that you want to become an energy sector thought leader, right? So what are you doing about it specifically? One of the things that I started to do is, I'm someone who's never been afraid to embrace visibility from a professional perspective, because first of all, from a female perspective, I realize there are a lot of young women who want to work in this sector. And I feel like I have a burden of representation. That is why I always agree to speak publicly, because I feel like it's not about me. So I always take opportunities that present themselves. It can be just start, if you find an interesting article on the energy sector, comment about it on your LinkedIn post. It could be something small, just a single paragraph. You start to do that more consistently. You start to build the credibility, the visibility, and the track record. And for those young professionals that have studied things like petroleum engineering, geology, fantastic technical degrees, but guess what? Don't forget the energy transition. Anybody who's working in the energy sector today has to have some knowledge of renewable energy. You can't tell me that because you came out of university as a petroleum engineer is oil and gas, because the reality is in 15 or 20 years time, the amount of available oil and gas jobs will shrink, and people will be looking more for people who are more well-rounded. So those are some of the things that I would advise people to do, and which I've seen work, amazingly for me. Really, I hope that helps.
Yes, it does indeed. Thank you so much. It's been a great time talking to you. To everyone who's watching, thank you very much for joining us. Till the next episode of Energy Solutions for the Future, I am Caleb Adebayo. Thank you.
Thank you, Caleb. Thanks for having me. Really grateful.